Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. What can be done to reduce the violence in Syria? What can be done to help restart the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians? How can we work together to make sure that Iran never develops nuclear weapons? We'll be back in just a moment to talk about these and other important issues. Welcome back to our program. You're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. If you have an interest in our programs, the topics, please feel free to go to the website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com and feel free to download any of the programs that we have there. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge as a public service. Again, if you're involved with a PBS station, community access television, it could be that you're involved with a university, an educational institution that has an intra-campus TV system, or if you just have a website and would like to share the programs with your colleagues, friends, family, or the community at large, please do so. Today we're taking a look at a very, very difficult area of the world, the Middle East. We're going to focus on Syria. We're going to talk a bit about Iraq, and then also about Israel and Palestine, as well as Iran. My guest today is an expert on the Middle East. My guest today is Dr. Michael Cairo. Dr. Michael Cairo is a professor of political science, and he's an associate dean for academic affairs at Transylvania University in Lexington, Kentucky, USA. Dr. Cairo has written, his recent book is The Gulf, the Bush Presidencies, and the Middle East, which was published in 2012. Dr. Michael Cairo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for having me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me. Mike, let's get into it. We'll start with your book to make sure we don't forget it. This is a copy of it. It's The Gulf, the Bush Presidencies, and the Middle East. Basically, what is the thrust of this book? We can't spend an hour on it. But
it's a comparison of the two Presidents Bush in their policies in Iraq mainly, but also Israel-Palestine, and placing them against one another in many ways as different sort of approaches to the Middle East and the ways in which they dealt with Saddam Hussein and with Israel and Palestinian peace.
And that's a good segue. When we get about halfway through the show, we'll be talking about Iraq and get into that in more detail. Well, let's get right into Syria. This is, without a doubt, the most difficult issue we're dealing with in the Middle East right now. We see millions of refugees have fled from Syria. The fighting has been going on. The civil war has been underway for at least 4 years, maybe closer to 5. We see the players, we see the problems. Let's get into the solutions. I know they're very difficult. The UN is trying to help. The Security Council has been paralyzed to a large degree, but UN agencies are on the ground providing humanitarian assistance, helping with refugees, doing a variety of things like that, providing food. But what are are there some solutions? I know it's an extremely difficult problem, but what can we do that we're not doing now?
Well, I'm not sure that there is anything we can do that we're not doing now, and that's part of the real challenge, is you've got a problem in the Middle East that is too complicated for simple solutions or simple answers. And I think, as you well know, lots of times the American public and other publics want a simple solution to problems like this. It's a problem that requires, on one level, diplomatic issues and negotiations. And certainly if we're going to go anywhere, you have to have the Russians involved and you have to have the Iranians involved. And that adds to the challenge of diplomacy. It's a problem that involves economics because of refugees and humanitarian issues, and it's a problem that involves the military because of groups like ISIS, as well as President Bashar al-Assad and his military. And I don't believe there is any will in the American public right now, or among many other countries, to have boots on the ground where you can really maintain a ceasefire.
That is really the crux of the problem, is it not? That most of the countries do not want to put boots on the ground. The U.S. definitely does not want to. The public doesn't want it to happen. NATO doesn't want to be on the ground. And you come in, you bring in outside forces, you look like an occupying force, which is what we looked like in Iraq when we were there for several years.
Absolutely.
But is there any way to get the Arab allies in that area more involved on the ground to help perhaps set up safe zones or something like that to allow these refugees to have places to go so they would not have to flee their country?
Well, one of the problems is that they have been involved on the ground to some extent. I mean, they're involved by backing and funding a variety of different groups on the ground. Part of this is the sectarian rivalry that exists between Saudi Arabia as one regional power and Iran as another regional power. Saudi Arabia being the Sunni regional power and Iran being the Shia regional power. But this also involves countries like Qatar and the UAE and other countries that are providing money to rebel groups that oppose Bashar al-Assad, who's associated with Iran and is Shia. And then Iran and now the Russians backing Assad. So I'm not certain that bringing the Arab countries in is necessarily going to facilitate a solution. And in fact, I would suggest it contributes more to the problem that we currently have at the moment, because both the Saudis and Iranians are using Syria and elsewhere as proxy wars, in essence. Yemen's another example of this, where you have the Houthi, who are Shia, being supported from the outside, or at least the perception is that they're supported from the outside, the Iranians, and the Saudis supporting the Yemeni government against that movement. So.
A large number of the problems, and you alluded to this earlier when you mentioned Iraq, a large number of those problems that we have today in that area of the world can be traced right back to the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003. This, we don't have time today to go back all the way to look at it, but as you look at the situation in Iraq, now it seems like that the Iraqis are actually starting to mobilize and starting perhaps to work together a little bit. We see, as of this taping, that Mosul is a city that the Iraqi army, with U.S. support and other support, the army is about to take that back. ISIS is really on the run to a large degree. They're going to be, basically, they're going to have one city in Syria that'll be their stronghold, and that may be about it. Now, they got pockets in various countries around the world.
Right.
But how do you view this situation with the invasion of Iraq and the contribution to the instability of the Middle East?
Well, the invasion of Iraq in 2003 created a vacuum of power, really, and that vacuum of power was filled by multiple actors. It opened up a door for Iran, for example, both into Iraq and into the larger regional discussion, as well as opening up a door for a group like ISIS. Remember that ISIS really emerges out of al-Qaeda in Iraq, but al-Qaeda in Iraq wasn't even in Iraq until after the invasion. It was in Jordan. It was led by al-Zarqawi. And then when the vacuum emerged during the war, al-Zarqawi moved into Iraq and established al-Qaeda in Iraq. And as al-Qaeda in Iraq was pushed back through our counterinsurgency efforts, a portion of that group basically emerged into ISIS, al-Baghdadi being one of the individuals who emerges out of that to take the lead in ISIS.
When we think back a couple of years ago when ISIS really came rolling through Iraq, you saw where the Iraqi soldiers threw their guns down, ran, even though they numerically outnumbered ISIS fighters, they just were paralyzed. They were frightened to death, I guess, to some degree.
Well, I think some of that was paralyzed because of the government and the leadership that Iraq had. You had, Nuri al-Maliki, Shia, and Iraq is divided between Kurds in the north, the Sunni triangle in the center, and Shia in the south, and Saddam Hussein had been associated with the Sunni triangle, but the Shia are really the majority. And when Nuri al-Maliki comes in as prime minister, he uses this sectarian politics as part of the patronage system and corruption, and it created resentment on multiple sides and contributed to a lot of the sectarian feelings among people that helped to create some of the challenges now being faced by Iraq.
And that was exactly what I was going to suggest, that was the problem. Nouri al-Maliki, who was Shiite, and he was the one who basically was discriminating against the Sunnis, was not working with them to a large degree, was actually making their life very uncomfortable.
Yeah,
and they thought it'd be easier to deal with ISIS than with their own national government.
Right, and you can even take this back to the invasion of Iraq as well, because we in the United States supported Nouri al-Maliki, and we also did a process of de-Baathification, which alienated a lot of the Sunnis who were part of the Baath party of Saddam Hussein. And de-Baathification basically meant unemployment, getting them out into the streets, and it contributed to the problems that you're seeing now.
The British have had an ongoing study for the past several years, really, I'm not too sure how long, but for several years, they called the Chillicothe Inquiry. And they went back and analyzed exactly the build-up to the invasion of Iraq. An invasion today is viewed by a large number of foreign policy people as an illegal invasion of a sovereign country. Saddam did not have weapons of mass destruction. There was really a mission by the U.S. government to go into Iraq regardless of what Saddam had or didn't have. But should the United States look into this? Should we have a Chillicothe inquiry in this country to maybe learn lessons from the Iraq War? Because, and I'll get to it in just a minute, the way the media are treating it today is not the way it was in 2003. A large number of the media are trying to rewrite history to a large degree, a sort of a revisionist approach. But do you think we should have that first?
Well, I think it's a tough question, because I also think that doing something like that can create a lot of divisions within the society. And right now, as you well know, American society is pretty divided, and I can only see that as adding to the mix in this. And so I'm not sure that it would necessarily serve to have a public forum on this. Comparison might be Benghazi and Libya. I'm not sure that that's really furthered or advanced anything more than the political positions of the various people involved in the argument. I think internally having these kinds of discussions is good, assuming that groups like the CIA and the State Department and the Defense Department are having these conversations. And that might be the very problem. They might not be having the conversations that you should be having. Probably the best way to facilitate it is through intelligence hearings that are oftentimes closed doors to talk about this. But
And that's very true. And another approach too might be that the media should actually look at what happened and not just put out some of this really nonsense. I mean, you have people coming out who are major contributors to building up basically a lie about Saddam Hussein. Judith Miller, who worked for the New York Times, has a book out that totally tries to paint a different picture of what happened in 2002, 2003, and led up to the invasion. You have people such as her, such as some other people who come out on Fox News and other outlets like that, and they say, everybody thought Saddam Hussein had weapons. No, everybody did not. In fact, the majority of the people, most people at the United Nations felt that they didn't. Even our allies at the UN would not support our invasion of Iraq. So I think we need the media to do a better job in looking at the historical ramifications of this.
Yeah, and I think some of the problem is that the media is very different today than it was 40 years ago. Today you basically have groups like Breitbart and and Fox News and MSNBC that take a very clear position in their reporting, and that distorts what they're looking at and how they're looking at it. I think it's wrong also to just argue that George W. Bush was on a singular mission and was going after Saddam Hussein no matter what. I think it's much more complicated than the simple stories that the media wants to tell from either side of this. And I think you're right that, if you go back to the 70s and think about Vietnam, the stories were similar. Because we had less media and less media money going to a lot of these different offshoots, you might say, or less mainstream media.
Exactly. And of course, you mentioned 40 years ago the media was different. Yeah. Really 10 years ago. 13 years ago when the war started. And today we have 24/7 cable television channels that have to fill the airways with
well, and you add the web
chattering
to it,
magpies
and you
at
add
times.
Twitter, and you add all
Right.
the other things to it, and it
Exactly.
just creates. It's easy to manipulate and create myths about things.
It
I mean,
is.
I think we see that in the presidential campaign.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that it's easy for someone to describe Syria or some other situation in a way that they want to and get that message out.
Exactly. And we need to have people, we all really need to learn more about these issues. That's the bottom line. The more
Absolutely.
we learn about them, the more intelligently we can discuss them and to focus on them, perhaps come up with some solutions. Before we leave the Sunni Shiite division in Iraq, do you think now with the new administration in Iraq that assuming Mosul is going to be retaken, which it looks like it's going to, it looks like the Iraqis will recapture the vast majority of their territory. Do you think there will be a closer working relationship and a more mature relationship between the Sunnis and the Shiites in the future?
Well, I think that's tough to say. I mean, for right now, you've got the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Both Iran and al-Abadi in Iraq are Shia and see the ISIS as an enemy, and so do a lot of Sunni leaders. And so you've got a common enemy. I'm not certain that without that common enemy, you're going to see the same kind of unity going forward. We can hope for it, and it might actually create some goodwill to produce that kind of unity.
And that's what we should hope for and
Yes.
try to move that forward. Because it's absolutely
and a lot of
crucial.
it might
Yes,
require the United States facilitating that and being willing to open the door to that. I think that's one of the reasons why Barack Obama made a deal with Iran. It wasn't simply to make sure Iran didn't get nuclear weapons on his watch, but it was also to begin a process in which Iran, since it is feeding some of these sectarian proxy wars, becomes or you create a rapprochement with Iran. You give it an opening, you give Iran an opening so that they can negotiate with countries like Saudi Arabia and others in the region to try and ameliorate some of these challenges, rather than isolating them.
Well, let's go to good segue into Iran. Let's talk about that just for a few minutes before we get into Israel and the Palestinian situation. Iran, right now we have an agreement, and from all indications it appears that this agreement is working very well.
Yes.
The Iranians agreed to it. It was the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council plus Germany, I believe, was involved, plus the EU and European Union and some other groups. But this is actually holding, and Iran has actually decelerated their nuclear program, which could have been disastrous because apparently they could have developed a nuclear weapon within 6 to 12 months before this agreement kicked in. How does that look right now?
It looks quite good. The thing that you're not mentioning is the things that are in place if Iran fails to meet the agreement as well, which also provide the stick. So there's a carrot and a stick here. But for Iran was hurting economically under the sanctions before this. Iran wanted to come out of its pariah status. And this offered that opportunity for Iran and a way to also facilitate, as I said, some mitigation in the region between countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran. I'm not saying that it's a panacea or it's solving the problem, but it opens a door to a potential rapprochement with some of these countries in the Middle East and cooperation.
That's right. And the one thing we have to keep in mind, too, that the main reason for the negotiation was to get Iran to commit to not develop their nuclear program further because they were on track. I think almost all the nuclear experts agreed they were on track to develop a nuclear weapon. And there are a lot of problems with Iran. They're subsidizing Hezbollah, they're holding political prisoners. Those are major issues and they're of concern. But I think we need to keep in mind that the number one goal is to make sure Iran does not get a nuclear weapon because that would destabilize the whole region and could kill millions of people.
And I actually think that if the agreement's broken at our side or by the West in any way, it only facilitates Iran and gives them more of a reason to go down that road of a nuclear weapon. So the agreement sends a signal to Iran. You're absolutely right.
And they could certainly do that in very short order, and that is something that we do not want because there's no way you can resolve this problem through military action. Bombing. Some people say, we'll just bomb their nuclear facilities. That simply will not work, will it?
No, I mean, if you want to accept that argument, it seems that when the Osirak reactor was bombed in Iraq by the Israelis, Iraq still continued to have weapons of mass destruction programs. It didn't stop them. And in fact, it hardened their view of why they might need them from a potential attack by an outside country, in that case, Israel. So the same could happen with Iran. If you attack them, you can get into a situation where you create the scenario that they argue they need the weapons for.
Exactly.
And give them the example.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned Israel.
Yep.
And Israel's been a challenge since the UN created it in 1947. It came online in 1948.
Yep.
What is the current situation? The peace process seems to be dead right now. Or
Yes.
At least it's on life support.
I would
perhaps.
say
totally
it's dead.
dead. Okay.
You know, when the Obama administration came into office, there was a lot of hope on the peace process. You might recall he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and this was after the speech in Cairo, Egypt. He skips going to Jerusalem as part of that, and that set off relations between the U.S. and Israel and Obama and Netanyahu in a negative way. Frankly, the United States has to be involved if a peace process is moving forward. And the Obama administration has not been as involved as they really could be. And a lot of that is the president. Hillary Clinton made an attempt. John Kerry made an attempt. But I think Obama's view is that unless it's going to be a winning issue on this, he's not going to risk political capital on it. And he doesn't see any movement by Netanyahu, who certainly is not willing to make any first moves on peace. And within the Palestinian community, Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, faces a lot of internal tensions. Simply going to the funeral of Shimon Peres, former president of Israel, who died, simply going to his funeral was seen as a traitorous act by some. Shaking the hands of Netanyahu went even further for others at that. So I think both sides are very intransigent on this, and I don't see any movement forward with either of the presidential candidates that we have. They both are very pro-Israel in what they're saying and in their thoughts about the policy, about the region.
In the last campaign that was held in Israel, current Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that he no longer believed in a two-state solution. That's right. Now, the UN is on record, almost every country in the world is on record supporting a two-state solution, a state for Israel, a state for the Palestinians. Is it actually feasible to have a one state over there, even though they're moving towards that? It looks like
I
with
think
the
they've
building
got
of
it,
settlements,
in essence.
they've got it in essence.
In essence, it is a one-state solution. I mean, if you look at a map with the settlements in the West Bank, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to understand how you might get two states out of that. And it's, in my opinion, a far-off idea that you could really have a two-state solution, despite what the rest of the world might like.
Yeah, is that feasible though with the demographics? If you look at the fertility rates and that type of thing, the Palestinians will outnumber the Israelis very shortly. And Yitzhak Rabin recognized that many years ago.
Which is why the West Bank hasn't been officially incorporated into the Israeli state, because you can't have a Jewish state without a Jewish majority. It's also why Gaza was let go in many ways. So if you don't fully incorporate it, but you control it, you essentially have a one-state solution, because the Palestinian Authority does not have the kind of autonomy that a regular state in the international system possesses.
In the last minute and a half that we have, if you had to make 3 bullet point suggestions, what would they be to promote peace and to restart the negotiation process between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Well, the first thing is that you have to focus on settlements, and the Israelis have to agree to stop settlement construction. You also have to focus on the Palestinian Authority controlling Hamas and any terrorist activity. And now one of their big problems is you have what you might call rogue terrorists, people who take a knife and go into the city or drive their bus into a group of people. The third thing is you have to have U.S. involvement, and it has to be steady involvement, and an involvement that encourages both sides, like a Carter at Camp David or a George H.W. Bush at Madrid, that wants to see both sides come to the table and talk.
That is absolutely critical. They have to restart at least the dialogue, get back together. They may not agree immediately, but at least they've got to come back together and try to get this process moving, because if they don't, it's just going to deteriorate. It's going to get even worse. But before we do wrap up, is this situation tenable in the situation where you don't have a one-state operation, but really there is a one-state operation, but they just haven't incorporated the West Bank?
Right.
Can that go on?
Well, it's gone on since '67. If you think about it, the big issue is economically, budgetarily, is it feasible? And I think that's why the Israelis have built a wall. If you can't maintain it, you basically confine the problem.
Exactly. Well, Dr. Michael Cairo, these are extremely important issues, and of course, these are some of the most difficult issues that are being dealt with at the United Nations and in many capitals around the world, because the Middle East does impact all of us. We may think, well, it's 6,000 miles away. Why worry about it? Wrong. It does impact us. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Really appreciate it.
I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.